No, I was just going to say the way he writes about the possibility of gathering and also this abscondedness, and that which is inconspicuous, and how it kind of kindles that which is conspicuous, or sort of cares for it in a certain sense, or holds it in a hidden way. I thought was really interesting. And I also find that his writing sort of allows for that in a certain way. Like, it brings you to those kind of spaces, like where you're kind of like, you're sort of at the edge of language or something. And I thought that was really cool, because it was like working on a demonstrative level as well as a descriptive level, you know, with in terms of the way he uses language. So I really like that. And then there were just a few bits and pieces that I would like to look into a bit more that I have notes for, but I'd like to hear what everyone else's general take was first, or yeah.
Daniel, what's just abscond yourself for a second.
Yeah, I mean, when we talked before, right? I read it today as well, as a preparation again. So yeah, they are like so. This is very mysterious. And there are the little pieces where just there something flashes, right? This is just flashing, just the phenomenological power of, just as Molly just said, the description itself, but the description points to something beyond. So that you now kind of, he's kind of like also like this, like a magician in that sense, like a poet is. The poet, they use language as a touchstone for something that is beyond.
Yeah.
I kind of like we are right on the edge then of what's kind of like sayable and what's not sayable, what's mysterious, what's absconded, what's hidden. We kind of like, we have to go through that, kind of like we arrive at perhaps this abscondedness, a truth in the deep sense.
Right. Yeah, totally. I'm so glad you guys talked about the inductive part of it, right? The inducing of the reading itself, the language itself. He's like once demonstrating what he's describing, right? Even in the anonymity of the author who disappears in the description of it is even demonstrating of it, right? Yeah, because I was reading it last night and I was so struck by everything that both of you just said about you know, it's funny because I've noticed this with like non-dual teachers or people that do like sanghas, right? That talk about kind of being enlightened and stuff like that, is they talk and you're to understand what they're saying in order to understand it is to do the thing that they're talking about. So what it takes to understand what they're saying is the very in some sense walks you into the description itself as a living kind of thing. That's why I think people get so high at those things, right? But that's the sense I have, and it was really interesting to read that again after watching that video of his and him talk about translating yourself in your mother tongue. So I got a sense of, you know, the image I kept coming to around it was, I kept thinking about weaving, right? Like the logos is something like in some sense the pure activity of weaving, right? You like imagine from the weaving perspective, right? There's something like just the weaving itself, right? You're just in your being, you're already grabbing the threads and then tying them together in a particular pattern. And at some point, it's like at some point, what you've woven feeds back to itself enough so you get more complicated, right? Or complex. And then some part of the weaving itself looks back and sees its own pattern. And in that moment that changes the weaving. And you have these other shapes that somehow refer back to the weaving, but also conceal it, right? And those shapes, I think, is what we call human being. Right? Something like that. Yeah. So what were some of the points that were more obscure for you, Molly?
Well, sorry, just about the weaving, yeah, that's really rich. And I think especially the interaction between space and weaving. If you take space as like an outside, it's very, very rich. It's not just full wholeness, you know, because there's gaps and in and out. But very interesting. I was just saying that I found, so there were two things that I was quite interested in. So one was it's on page 107 where he talks about eternality, and eternality not as a conception within linear time, that something lasts forever, nor something which is kind of beyond time because it lasts forever. It doesn't even have a temporal component, but something which like is, ever will be, and ever was, kind of, as I understood it, in its revealing, or so like in the act of I can't even pronounce it. Aletheia is eternal, because maybe this is how I understood it, but I'm open to hear what you guys think. But I thought maybe it's because of the fact that we're always saying with Heidegger and so on, you know, something always already was, and that there's this kind of like necessity almost to ascomness, you know, to what is hidden. And there's this interdependence between us as gatherers and that which is to be gathered, that then means that when something is revealed or is unconcealed, there's this kind of eternality or necessity to it. But I wanted to hear what you guys thought about that, because it wasn't entirely clear to me. Like, I was full of wonder though. I was just really dazzled and sort of excited by it. But I actually, in the moment when I tried to understand it, it was less exciting. That's a funny thing too. It was really exciting when I first read it though.
So one trick is, whenever you see Daniel do this, go ask him.
Yeah, I mean, when we read the text, right, he says that there is an experience of a more original, or I would perhaps say more elemental time, the time of the principle itself. And then he's describing kind of like how this time manifests itself to us. And I think it's best if we just read the passage once more. Yeah. So we kind of like, yeah. So he says, in Heraclitus, time, or the eon, is close to being thought of as the principle.
What page is it again?
107.
Okay.
Is close.
First or?
No, it's at the bottom of the page.
Okay, got it. Okay, go.
In Heraclitus, time, or the eon, is close to being thought of as the principle itself in the form of the unitary interplay of ever was, and ever will be, and ever is, so that the flashing of the cosmos in its inextinguishable regeneration is the unceasingly coming advent, ever will be, of the already become instant, ever was, of clearing and freeness, ever is, which in its impregnable discontingency impends on man as the nearness itself for his world, which that nearness ever waits for his mindful bearing response. In the formula, time is the nearness of the coming of the become instant. So it's kind of like time in this kind of like eternal interplay of this ever was, ever will be, and ever is kind of like clearing a nearness where we have the possibility for world, something like that, I think.
Yeah.
For cosmos.
I think that's, sorry to interrupt you, and go ahead. No.
No.
I was just going to say, what it made me think of initially when I read it, and I think that's kind of close to what you were saying, is kind of like an experience of revelation where, and I've kind of read sometimes about people think sometimes, like, for example, Christian revelation is a moment where time itself changes because our world, the world of the person and the society changes so fundamentally because there's this kind of reevaluating of time itself. So those moments are kind of eternal, and they kind of get at the schism, they kind of get at the edges. But I find it's really funny because I find everything whenever I try to describe this in language, I definitely get a picture of what you're saying and of what was written as being a very wonderful, interesting conception of time. But I keep being frustrated whenever I try to pin it down because I feel it's something that doesn't want to be pinned down. And yeah.
So that's kind of like what Augustine describes, right? So always when he, right, I know what time is, but when I try to speak about it, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it kicks back. Like that's what's interesting about it. Just keeps striking me about this sense of the original phenomenology, right? Of translation, right? Which is so interesting to think about the mother tongue, right? It's called a mother tongue, right? In some sense. And it doesn't say father tongue, which is interesting, right? Because I think there is this holding, nurturing quality that keeps showing up, right? I think you pointed that out in the last time we met, Molly, that like this empathic sense, this gathering has this kind of holding, nurturing, sustaining quality without it ever being sitting still somehow, right? That's the interesting thing about this, is like the logo somehow it has this gathering, letting thing at the same time, this gathering, letting, and you're right, there is something in I guess my inframed, American positionality just wants to get that thing and then just nail it down and hack it or something, but you're right, it demands a lot. It demands a lot of your mouth, right, to speak it. But that's interesting. That thing that's unsatisfying, right? When you talk about it, that thing that kicks back. I really appreciated what also Ivo said about. He kept saying these things like, language says no, try again. Like that's not going to work, right? Like you have to. You have to listen to, in translating from another language, you have to listen somehow to the primordial saying, the primary experience, right, in which that's then translated in that mother tongue into your language. But then there's this thing you're checking, right, that lets you know whether or not it's the right word or not the right word, or it's said in the right way or not the right way. It's not going to be the same as over there, but the mother tongue of mother tongue, right? So that thing, so I'm just curious, that sense that because it's also too, right, just that, and everyone knows this experience, like it's the commonest thing. I was thinking about this. It's one of the things I like about circling, because you kind of end up in these places where you ask somebody a question, or a question shows itself to be asked. We'll put it like that. That at some point the person's got to stop, and it's as if they got to look into the back of their head or something, and then no one has any idea what they're going to say, but it's a question about themselves, right? It's like the one they've been living with their whole life, right? And they have to go back and come into this original relation, and then come to terms, right, with this experience, right? And we all know this experience because it's not one of, I have this experience and then I have a bunch of different words in front of me that I can kind of pick and choose. That's not how the experience is, right? I think that's how it's described a lot. But like the experience is there some, I'm tuning into something like something like my experience, and then I'm listening to something and I start to sound it out, right? And I may go a little bit left and it goes, no, 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 no. And you come back, right? And then you sound it out and you look, and you're doing this, dun, 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 and you're kind of like this combination of listening, saying, right? God, that took me somewhere. I forgot where I started. What did I just say? What was I talking about?
Just go on, Guy.
the weaving lost its weaver. Look back, there's no one back there. You know, and I think that the other thing too about this is, and I think this goes back to your wondering, Molly. There's, you know, in the very last few pages, he kind of, he goes into not Phusis. Oh yeah, into Phusis, right? Actually, let's read his description of Phusis really quick. Let's go to like page 110. Phusis comes from the verb phio, which means to bring forth, beget, and gender, let grow. We usually understand and translate phusis as nature. In both meanings, this word has for us the entirety of natural as opposed to artificial things, and a given essential character. I am an honest man by nature. However, if we simply substitute phusis with nature and these given expectations, not much is granted for our understanding. In fact, this translation by substitution implies that nothing new can ever be learned. In order to let phusis speak to us according to the manner in which it is heard in Greek thinking. So that part right there, so not just replace one word with another word, right? But in some sense, crawl inside of it, right? In order to let phusis speak, right? So this letting speak is really interesting. To us according to the manner in which it is heard in Greek thinking. Must pay attention to the grounding trait that is indicated in this word, namely the trait of spontaneous self-standing rising into the open. Thus, physis indicates the original generosity and favor of the from itself arising, rising into the open, and stable laying or abiding in the open of beings in whole. In this manner, phusis is what lets beings in whole rise and stand in the open as such, thus setting them free into their appearing and being. And what finally keeps or preserves this appearing and being within itself as its source Finally, phusis is what lets beings arise, insofar as they disappear and cease to be. In short, phusis is the stable rising that holds in itself all appearing and disappearing. Does that clarify things for you, Molly?
I think it's really interesting because, I think that at the beginning, I'll just get the page for you. I think it's page 90. He talks about how he talks about some understandings of the logos. I can read it if you, will I read it or will I just?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So, let me just get the right place. Oh yes, here we go. So if you do not listen to me, but rather to, oh, sorry, my move. I'm sorry. She was just knocking on the window there. Okay. The common attitude towards the thinker is not that of listening through his words towards that to which his speaking answers, thus letting oneself be concerned by that which says itself through the thinker's words, but to take what he says as his words, as an utterance that emanates from him and ultimately is about him, insofar as it states his point of view or his opinion. In short, the common attitude is to take a thinker's utterances as a sense that is conditional upon the given being he happens to be, a sense that, on the other hand, the given beings that we are might, from our point of view, acknowledge and reserve the right to accept or to reject it. Okay, I'm just going to stop there because that's what I really wanted to illustrate. I think it's really important when we're talking about translation. So there's this issue, interpersonal issue, where we have different subjects, right? And they have different worlds. And according to a common understanding of like logos and what's happening, we have different views. And it's really important then, if he's trying to argue that this isn't what's happening with dialogue, then we shouldn't just make this wider such that we have Greek language, English language, Greek language and worldview, English language and worldview, and a new type of relativism, which isn't like an individualism per se, but more of a type of relativism where we're saying, okay, so this is what it means within this worldview, and this is what it means within this worldview. So I think he's saying two things. It's not just that you can't crudely substitute it. Even if you say because he says the substitution means there's no more knowledge. So you can't just say, I'm just going to substitute it for how it functions, say, within the Greek worldview versus within the English worldview. But you also can't say, I'm going to step inside the Greek worldview and see it from their perspective, because he's trying to get beyond that sort of subjectivism or relativism. It's more like the language itself is saying, and that's what you're picking up on, is this phusis disclosing itself, and the terrain or the sort of the abscondedness as well, what's sheltered there, what's concealed, what's revealed, what's the terrain. So I think that's really interesting, because I think it's really hard for us because we naturally think about it in terms of interlinguistically, and even when you say something like intra-linguistically, or it still implies this kind of subjectivism. So I just wanted to draw attention to that passage as well.
Oh, great. Wondering, is that sense of the mother tongue of mother tongues, right? In some senses that, in some sense, I guess you could ask, what is it that even makes possible a translation that it all relates to the other language? If on some level there wasn't some kind of already always thing both languages were dwelling in, right? Huh.
Yeah, sorry, can I go, or would you like to respond to that, Daniel?
No, go on.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I feel that's really what he was talking about in his talk, where when their translation occurs, there's this kind of contact almost with the wellspring of language itself. And that's why it's such a, and I guess that's also connected to those moments where you don't understand something, bring about a real vitalization and wonder sometimes, like with me with the time thing, because it's like, because you don't understand it, it brings you beyond language, you know, into maybe a space that grants language. So yeah.
Right, right. Daniel.
I think we should perhaps go to an example. That's perhaps a good thing.
Okay.
So on page 98, for example,
98.
In the middle, he says, the meaning of homologane can be elucidated as follows. Having tuned oneself into the logos, gathering, saying the same as the logos, and thus being in accordance or in tune with it. More precisely, being one and the same tune. Now hear the musicality with the logos itself. In short, being a unison, ein Klang unisono. Klang in German is kind of like sound, not sound, but more like the color of sound, something like that. So tune in is kind of like that. And unisono, right? You perhaps you don't hear this in unison, but there's the sonata in classical music. You kind of like you tune into the musicality of the logos, this self-weaving, so to say, that produces a meaningful pattern. And that's kind of like the source or the principle from which then kind of like the languages are like little branches going away. But if you go back to the source, you kind of like, and you really listen into it real deeply, you really, then you can perhaps get close to this kind of like the primordial phenomenon that gives rise to that, and then it gets articulated in the particularity of the language. But it's cool if you're kind of like, sometimes you have this, you have the same phenomenon. It's similar in all languages, and many languages. It's really a cool thing, I think. And that's perhaps, right, as I said this on Saturday when we talked together, with this kind of like, there are these primordial words like the O, this kind of like the astoundment. And you can find them in all languages in a sense, because they stem from a deeper source than
prefix,
kind of
right?
like, yeah, this O, this interjection when you're like, when you're astounded, when you're in wonder,
yeah,
when you are just, you look around and say, oh, it's so wondrous. That's kind of like, that there are kind of like these primordial words which seem to come from a deeper source, or even arise from a deeper source in a sense, then like, that's not in us. That's also one thing that kind of like, I think he clarifies in the passage Molly read.
Yeah.
That this is, right, this is this, often you start writing and it's as if the writing writes itself. Yeah. So that's why we have to think here a lot in this middle voice, this grammatical construction that is neither purely subjective nor purely objective. Yeah. So you kind of have, the middle voice is kind of like this self-spontaneous, this self-standing, just pure acting in and what's affording this act is kind of, that's physis. Right. And what this points us to, right? We have this deep coupling between speaking and thinking and listening. And what all of that points us to is that there's, right, this is this, when we have these shifts, just these, right, sometimes we have just these little shifts in this deep, when we really have deep dialogos, so to say, we transcend just a little bit, we transcend our capacities in a sense. So we go into a more space. That's where this is also, that's inspiration. That's revelation. That's what Molly said before.
Yeah.
That's also then when time becomes so intensified and rich, so to say.
Yeah.
And that shows us then this more dimension, this moreness that we often tend to forget when we think of time just as a linear line, or as language, as just like a function also.
It's funny, things are flashing, like different things are flashing as we're talking. There's in my work for it's interesting because doing this thing that I do called circling, which ended up being kind of like my career, if you want to call it that, was in some sense this something showed itself, right? And myself and Jerry just spontaneously, we had this experience that showed itself, right? And myself and Jerry, after it was over, looked back and went, that what was that thing? And we didn't have a word, but in some sense we shook hands and committed to that, whatever that was. And then for the next 20 years was the process of finding out what the hell we were pointing to, right? This kind of back and forth experience, right? And so part of that has been this experience of having it happen and noticing it, and then noticing it when it doesn't happen, and then when it does happen, and this kind of developing an ear for it, right? Before we even know what exactly it is, but there is this kind of quality of something shows, but it doesn't, but it hides at the same time, right? This showing, hiding, right? This, and clearly nothing about some kind of idiosyncratic step of how to do it, right? Which made it very difficult to try to teach, right? But as we attuned to it, so I'm just kind of talking about this experience just to kind of, so you guys can, if we can kind of bring this into this, right, in some way. Doing it over and over again, having this experience, it was when we started to notice, I started to notice, well, one, that we didn't know how we went about having that experience until the moment I had, I don't know, 15 people commit to 2 years to train them in how to do it. It was the moment I realized I didn't really know how to do it, right? But then I started to notice these differences in these patterns in it, right? And once I started to see these patterns and was able to bring some of it into language, was the moment that I felt like, okay, now I can begin to teach it, right? So there's this kind of quality of like, and they think they talk about this as a method always precedes theory. Like you never have a theory that then somebody develops a method, really. It's more like somebody like something arises, right? And it keeps happening. And then somebody starts to see it and brings it into language. And if it's done well, I imagine, the theory allows for that arising to articulate itself further, right? And so the theory and the method, right, start to open each other further, right? In these kind of autopoetic, reciprocal, like I'm thinking of John's term, reciprocal opening, right? That starts to happen. And it'd be interesting to think about, like, where, if we just look in our lives, like where is that thing happened? Where on some level the logo spoke and we heard it, and we didn't assign it to the speaker, right? But we actually heard the logos, right? In such a way that it then spoke back to us. And then this kind of other self-weaving world relation, where have you guys experienced that before? I just gave an example for me. What comes to mind? Like I'm imagining Molly for sure in some of your poetry and your art.
Yeah, definitely. Like I've had those experiences, and what I find so, and I also get it, sometimes you just go out for a walk, and I think there's a poem by Seamus Heaney where he talks about you're driving around a corner and the sea just basically, I can't remember, rips your heart right open, something like this, but it's just like a shock and you're not expecting it. And I think that's what's really interesting about what you say, is because what you're doing, which is really admirable, is to try to find a methodology which is still receptive of this thing which is concealed, and still receptive of that concealedness, which is really interesting. Because I think with me in my life, a lot of the time I've always thought of it in this kind of dichotomous way, where it's like, it's so wonderful when the surprise happens, and then there's this other aspect of my life which is more planned and more, but how do I gather, how do I harness, how do I sustain a surprise, without spoiling its nature? And that has always been a struggle. Like, it's only recently that I've begun to learn to be appreciative, to be receptive of it, without disappointed that it's not there, not to be fully passive or active, that kind of balance between the two, which you're describing, between trying to theorize, trying to practice, trying to understand. Because I think, just to conclude now, but I think it's, because of the fact that we live in a society where logos has been misinterpreted as something that can be controlled, something that can be compartmentalized, then when there is this kind of flash of resistance, this kind of flash of inspiration, of beauty, you can sometimes think that that's anti-logos, that you must reject reject almost rationality in order to think that. So then there's like, but that in turn is itself a type of compartmentalization. So I feel like the true quest is to kind of transcend those dichotomies and to harness linguistically, rationally, carefully, empathetically, and with respect to logos, what is revealed and what is concealed. So I find it really interesting to hear you talk about your project. That's just how it just relates to me personally.
So for you, it's like it sounds like you've actually encountered this and struggled with it, right? And it's this relationship between, there's that surprise, which what I heard you say is that disabscondedness, right?
Yeah.
Right. And the nature of that is it's surprising. So it's been kind of a practice on some regard to not crave that or want that, right? But to realize it kind of gives inner anguish because you don't want to spoil its nature. So if you it's not that I don't seek it or hope for it, but I think it gave me I find it like, even for a while I'd be like, I can't have a routine because I have to just wait for inspiration, and I just have to do what I feel like all the time, and then I'll be taken by surprise. But there needs to be maybe some sort of middle ground where you can kind of harness and gather. And that's really what I find interesting about the Heraclitus, but also with the Haider, is he allows for humanism, which is still receptive and which is still caring. Because I feel like, can be an attitude that like humanism is necessarily tyrannical, like it's kind of like claiming nature, and so we must be post-human, we must be entirely passive or something like this. But with these kind of philosophies, you get a middle ground, which is like both receptive and active, caring, receiving, reciprocal, as you said. So yeah.
I'll stop talking now.
Right.
I always think that of the hyphen, right? We always always in between of those forces.
Yes.
And that's also captured again, that's captured with this middle voice. It's not entirely active, it's not entirely passive. That's like, that's also the, right, John is in this inactivist camp of the mind philosophy. The mind is not here, it's kind of like out there. We have a distributed cognition, as he says, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not just a subjectivistic entity, and that's not how it works. So we are kind of like in this, always in this in-between, and have to endure these forces and give firmness to this struggle of letting go and then receiving something, of emptying ourselves so the fullness can arise. In Zen, that's often described in that way. We have to empty ourselves so the fullness of being can flow into us. Because we have this self-centeredness, right? That's this, we always kind of like, we always want to go into ourselves and kind of we have this infinite self-centeredness. It's almost archetypal, kind of like we have to always kind of like let go of that, so we can allow for the fullness of the world and for the moreness.
Would that
then you have this reciprocal play between the suchness, the mystery of suchness, and the mystery of moreness.
Yeah.
And that can come about then.
Right. One second, I'm gonna.
It's that sort of thing where it's not about power, you know, and when that thing is lacking, it becomes about power, you know. It's about the disclosing of what's hidden, and also vibing or attuning to each other. So I thought it was fantastic as well.
Yeah, I find this so mysterious, kind of like when thinking, this distributed thinking aligns itself, and then we just go into full transcendence and just play, and then the music also just arises from itself, and that's so wonderful, and it's also so intimate and emphatic, right? You said this, Molly, right? That's so emphatic and full of love and wonder.
Totally. Yeah, and I think, but it's also really interesting because it's interesting to hear what you say as well, because from what I hear from what you were saying just before, was kind of like, we can harness it, we can practice it, we can have a methodology for it, you know, even though it takes us by surprise. It's to do with a certain form of or openness in a way, and that way you'll be open to taking yourself outside yourself, you know. And that's really interesting, because I
think we can practice that. So we kind of like we can harness the strength to let that arise, that wonder. But that's kind of like, that's hard work. That's why Ivo often says the human being is like a job. It's like a task. And Heidegger practiced this with his 102 volumes or so, 10 hours writing a day, and just I mean, he did it like
most of
it. Kind of like he compared it, right? Ditch now compared it to like going to the gym for every day of your life, so to say. So cultivating the firmness to your being.
Well, like to think about this practice, right? Because it's hard to read De Janeiro, right, in that chapter, especially as he just starts opening each word, right, and showing how each word reveals itself, right? And then going back to the original sentence, and then you look at that, it's like, right, it sings. Meanwhile, in reading it, you've had to become someone who could see that at the same time, right? It's this phenomenological at onceness and going on all these different directions, right? So there's something about like the practice of philosophizing. It's interesting, reading that seems to be the practice of philosophizing. Yes, go ahead. Force slips
No,
away.
it's so deeply coupled, right? You said this before with the non-dual teachers. So kind of like you do the weaving, but there's also this kind of like this transcendence at the same time. Nishitani liked the word realization in the English language because it has this double aspect. And he then put it like understanding and apprehension at the same time. So when you write, you realize it and you write it out at the same time. So it becomes manifest in the world at the same time. That's what a poet is doing. So you have the double aspect and this deep coupling of kind of like understanding and apprehension.
Yes.
And that's so cool about it. And also that's then what's kind of like actively responsible for this transcendence. And this also shows you how non-dual everything is, in a sense. It's not just me that is writing, but it's like an active engagement with the world at the same time.
Right. So that self-centeredness that you're talking about, and the gravity of that self-centeredness, and kind of elucidating the point that you were highlighting, Molly, about the, this kind of relative kind of point of view thing, right? That I think it does seem to me that that's something like we listen to ourselves, right? Is also to not listen to ourselves, right? It's to listen in some sense through ourselves to the logos, right? That in some sense, like listening, like that Heraclitus chapter is something like a radical non-narcissism or something, right? But it's not saying that the self is just like that there's Heraclitus and that you listen not to him, but to the logos. He's not saying, in fact, in some sense, in what sense is Heraclitus necessary, right? In what sense is the self necessary in order to hear the logos, right? So there's this kind of quality, and I think I heard echoes of it in Molly when you were talking about this struggle, right? And I know exactly what you mean. Like, man, it's just, yeah, it's almost like I remember at art school, the last thing you wanted to do, right, is leave the studio when the painting wasn't working. But the last thing you want to do is keep staying, right, until it starts working, because there is this something that just doesn't, it's not up to you, right? It's not up to you on some level. And it does have this experience when it blossoms open, there is a sense of grace to it, right? But so if we look at this in terms of philosophia, right, is the practice of philia sophia, right? In that sense, in some way, as a continual practice of that right relation to this, right? That, yes.
Yeah, again, I was just going to say that's really interesting as well, because we see with that, even that struggle, like, and what you were describing, so it's bringing me to the edges, so I'm sort of forgetting as I go. But what you were describing about like the struggle of being at once contained within the ego and wanting to be outside that, and like that kind of, then the beauty of the moments where, and of grace or inspiration where you're taken outside. But in a way, like, not to oversimplify, but it seems that here we also have a kind of a relationship of opposites, a concealing and revealing, a containment and an openness. And like it's possible. Now, I don't want to get to a big general conclusion that ruins the process of the dialogue, but it's possible that that, you know, this contrast is what brings about the beauty of, you know, the process of life itself. You know, like that fact that we struggle with ego is what allows, you know, grace to be so wonderful. And equally, you know, I don't know, I just do wonder though, because it does seem, when we talk about like, and on one hand it seems a bit like that, but on the other hand, when we talk about phusis and the self-disguising of phusis, it seems very different to the sort of self-disguising of the ego, in that the self-disguising of the ego isn't a sort of wholesome kindling disguise. It's a kind of like a death drive. It kind of ruins things. So yeah, it kind of like tries to contain, tries to utilize, all of that sort of thing. But maybe, you know, maybe if we accept the ego, we can find a way of being internal, being subjective, which isn't like that. I don't know, like maybe it could be like a phusis, like a type of self-disguising, which is rich and which is kindling. What do you guys think?
Look, I think it's like, I think whatever it is that we think, hopefully it's out of hearing something. Right, it's out of hearing something. I keep thinking about, maybe we should actually read that Heraclitus passage where it talks about the difference between listen to me, like not to me, but the logos. So the thing of remember, the thing that he was talking about is that it's logos and the one. Oh yeah, when he was talking about the one, right? That it's actually happens. It's the gathering letting, right? This gathering letting. In fact, it's so ordinary. It's like this you know, glasses. It simultaneously that at the same time it's actively gathering as in this unity called the glasses, right? But yet it's letting show, right? So there's a unity, there's the one and the many in every single thing, right? So it's something like the togethering difference, right? The unitary difference in itself, the in between, it never appears. It's a non-appearing flagrancy, right? But it makes flagrant all of the particular differences between things. So I think what it is it's like as you exhale and you listen to the music, and then when you see the notes, look between the notes, right? Because it's between the notes, which is where the one is, if you say, in its activity of revealing, concealing itself. And that's the thing I've noticed too with most insights, like personal insights I've had, like mind-blowing things. It's usually some version of seeing something that was right in front of my face the whole time. Right? It's usually these kind of activities of just seeing some deep frame in which was constituting my whole life as my mother issues, right? And then trying to solve them, right? Thereby necessitating my mother issues in order to solve for something, right? Whatever it is, right? Like seeing the thing I was seeing with, in some sense, right? It seems like that's got that kind of nature of like where, and this is what, yeah, that's what it is. That's what the practice seems to be, or what I felt in some sense hypnotized in the reading of the language, is it kept it kept locating me further and further in the always already, just behind my eyes, concealed but determining and constituting that. So it's always like here is so much closer than I think. It's always closer. Everything is so much closer than I ever think, right? Something like that. You want to read the
Yeah, we can read it.
yeah,
Sure.
let's read it. Yeah.
So that's on page 89.
89. All right. So I'll
Shall
go
we read the long one?
Yeah, let's read the and I'll go and read the long one. If you do not listen to me, that is, to my words, as if they were merely a statement of how things are to me and for me, but rather to what my saying indicates, to wit, the logos. That is the gathering. That is the gathering, if, as a consequence, you yourself mind in and tune into it, and indeed tune in with it, thus owning to your being's native belongingness to it. Then an accordance in gathering breaks a tune in one's voice, naming an accordance in which your own gathering, the gathering in which your being consists, belongs to the same with, and indeed gathers the same as the original gathering, in such a way that your gathering actually gathers the gathering itself, so as to let all things be gathered accordingly, there in the flagrancy and openness of the accordance, a fitting knowledge of the original gathering holds the knowledge in which the gathering itself shows as the one atoning all, that is, as the one that, by virtue of its atoning, kindles beings as such and in whole. Hallelujah. That's what I want to say. What are we hearing in that? The short version is, if you do not listen to me, but rather to the dance in gathering, a fitting knowledge holds one all. You're on mute. You're on mute, Daniel. Better plug in.
So what I particularly like about this passage is kind of like this gathering that occurs kind of like from itself. And then he says it kindles beings as such and in whole. And I think that's the disclosure of something like an order, just an, and also I think it also shows a kind of like a deep reciprocality within that order. But kind of like we have to kind of like we have to tune into it, and that's again very interesting for me, because what he talks about, it's, as you said, Guy, it's kind of like he writes at one page, this principle has the trait of being over close, over near, so to say. So just tuning yourself into that, although it's like just a tiny shift perhaps, is so difficult, because it's fleeting. It's, listening to the logos is not or being in tune with the logos is not a simple thing in that sense.
Yes. It's similar to like the sound appears, but the music doesn't. Right?
Yeah, because he kind of has this contrast between like a harmony and a made totality.
Yeah.
And I think a question that emerges as well is like how much, obviously we can be open to receive the harmony, but how much of the harmony happening is even within our control? You know, how even if we're listening, we're trying to be attuned to the logos as much as possible. There might be some times where it just won't arise, you know, because that's again kind of like what Guy was saying, and also kind of what Heidegger talks about, you know, with the wine example. Sometimes you don't get a good harvest for, and there's grape, you know, and Eva de Janeiro talks about grapes as well. Sometimes you don't get the earth kind of says no. And you were talking about this as well, Guy, when you kind of mistranslate something or you try to attempt, and then there's this kind of dissonance. There's a kind of it doesn't sound right, and there's this kind of resistance from logos, or from the mother language, or from the mother of mother languages, mother of mother tongues, that kind of like fights back in her way, like almost like when you go to stroke your cat or something and she doesn't want you to stroke her, you know, that kind of thing.
Right, totally. And this is why it's so, this is probably why like punishing kids doesn't really, like harshly punishing children doesn't really help their learning, even if what you're punishing them for is accurate, right? Because on some level it pushes back and it goes, no, that's not quite it, try again. But if you think it's you, right, that is not getting it or made the mistake or something like that, if you don't realize you're listening to something, attuning to something, you'll assign the no to yourself, right, or to the other person, and then you'll just kind of go into a self-regress loop, right? It's like that kind of overarching superego critical voice that just pounds you anytime you like do anything, try to do anything new. It's like, who are you? Like, think you are, or whatever. So there's a way where one of the ways I think an example, an ontic example, right, or psychological example of this, where this kind of shows through analogy, is this precise way that keeps me actually from opening, in some sense, to actually hearing it, right, which is this super ego thing that just assigns everything to the self. It only hears Heraclitus, right? It only hears that, right? Yeah. And in that kind of thing where, you know, the word play keeps, it's very, there's something about this with play, right? It's very playful. Were you gonna say something, Daniel?
I think when we come to this now, it's kind of like we perhaps need to talk about just education, or just how the human being kind of develops. And I always think then about Nietzsche, because Nietzsche said kind of like, first you have to become the camel, then the lion, and then you can become the child again, right? And the spirit of the camel is also kind of, is the spirit of depth. So kind of like this capacity to bow down to kind of like, for religion, for everything that's ritual, because that allows you to cultivate a depth within you. And that's also kind of like mirrored when you said kind of like the silence between the notes of a play of music. Usually you think the silence is just nothing, right? But when you listen long enough, you can see it has a depth, and that depth is not just a depth, but that's inexhaustible. That's also then sometimes when you sometimes poets, it's as if this is inexhaustible, this nothing, what we're talking there. It's not privative. It's deep. It's full in the deepest sense. In order to cultivate that, we have to become the camel first, use now Nietzsche's image first, and to kind of like internalize the spirit of the camel, to kind of like to be humble, to be grounded, to learn to dwell in the world.
in some sense, that place where it doesn't happen, right? It doesn't, like the harvest doesn't come, right? The words don't, the painting won't paint, do what I want. Like there's this, that moment, it's interesting because how do I know, or when language goes, not that word, right? It kicks back. In some sense, if there's a happening going on, right, for us, right? How do we know it's not on, like on some level? If it wasn't in some way addressing us, right?
I was just going to say, I almost feel like there's layers of attunement, because even to go back to the music example which Daniel was talking about, like there clearly are pauses in music which are part of the music itself, like anticipatory pauses, like within the drums, for instance, that are like do, and you're just waiting and it's like it lands, But then I think there's also kind of a silence of, when you're making music, for example, of what listening to what and all the possibilities of what could be. And there, where you're talking about poetry, there's this kind of silence which isn't in the music, which has a different kind of texture, a different kind of depth. And in terms of that question about, what knowing when things fit and when things don't fit, like it seems to almost imply that, we have like an attunement which takes place like sometimes, but then we also have another level where we can attune to whether we're attuned or not, and we have some sort of sense capacity to sort of say like, that doesn't sit well, that sits well. Now I'm in the moment, now I'm feeling it, now I'm not, now the harvest is giving me something.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
It makes me think about, and it's interesting how logos and listening are like this, right? He doesn't use a lot of like seeing metaphors. He's mostly like, in terms of logos, it's listening to the logos, which is telling, I think, too, of the phenomena. But what's interesting about when people, because when people come and get trained to lead circles, right? A lot of circling is about this deep kind of almost rational listening. And what's interesting is when people start to learn how to listen, they always start off with, no one ever thinks that they're the one that's not listening, right? Everyone always thinks like, right, that the other people are the ones that don't listen, but I listen, right? Because it's true. It's like whenever you're listening, you never think to yourself, I'm not listening right now. You think you're listening, right? But what's interesting is the moment you make listening explicit, right? And this is what's interesting, is you can't actually positively teach someone how to listen. Like you can't, just in the same way that I can't describe to you how I think a thought. I just think, right? So this, so what you do is you just kind of create this, whatever the exercise is, such that it makes listening an issue. And all of a sudden people have like realize, like not only were they not just listening, but they start to realize that they've never listened to anyone, right? They've never listened. But what's paradoxical right there, if you kind of hear it, is that's where that moment of realizing I've never listened in my entire life, right, is the moment listening begins, right? It's because you can begin, and speaks to what you just said, is that when you begin to hear that there's a way that you hear, right? Or you begin to listen to that you're listening, right? And you can hear, right, the way that you haven't heard is listening to your listening. And that's the moment listening begins. So in some sense, there's this kind of quality of like where it's in some sense, it's like a negative theology in some regard, or a negative kind of thing where it's catching yourself in the moment of not listening, that something breaks through, right? And that something you can start to tune into. Yeah.
It makes me think about growth. A lot of what you're saying makes me think about like growth. And it's really interesting because I think there's a pain, like there's kind of like, with there's just two things. Like the one thing is kind of what both you and Daniel were saying about that nearness of your world, which you can't see because it's almost the space within which everything is granted. It's really hard to see it. But then when you do see it, that allows for transformation. And it's just, and then I'm just kind of repeating, but also this idea of struggle, because I feel there's a struggle in growth as well, because I feel when you encounter an experience that might open you up or bring something new, there's a kind of push pull, because there's a part of you that doesn't resist change, and then there's a part of your heart that opens, that wants to move forward. So yeah, just that about struggle and about the perception of the nearness. It's really interesting. It makes me think about quite a lot about growth, and kind of growth is kind of a paradox, because it's something, and also when you're talking about weaving, it's like a snake shedding its skin. There's a relationship to origin, but there's also a huge transformation. It remains the same, but there's a transformation happening. So there's kind of a paradox within all forms of growth. Anyway, so yeah.
I would then say again, that's again the paradoxical situation we are thrown into. We kind of like, we have to endure it, right? That's a great difficulty. And one point I want to raise, that Ivo de Gennaro is also very important for him, is skole, right? It's not just about practice, but it's also about the place and the time for practice, because that is important. So right, that's what was his name? Josef Pieper, the German philosopher we covered in the idleness course with Johannes. He said, idleness or leisure or skole is to time what is the temple to space. And we need kind of like a space time where we can even then practice, because otherwise the practice becomes distorted by all of the things that divert our attention, right? So that's I think why de Gennaro was kind of saddened when he said it's so difficult for young people today, because right, when you write something and you're sitting or in like the blank canvas, then you have to like take your time until something arises, or that you can even bring yourself into this kind of like this state, and you can start writing.
So good. Let's do this again. Yeah.
That was so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Good getting to know both good getting to know you via through you and the Logos. Let's do it again. I'll email everybody and I'll set it up.
Great.
Perfect.
Oh.
Thanks a million. Okay.
Bye bye.